watches the Seattle channel out there? Wow. This is usually where I pause for laughter. Thank you very much for being engaged in what we do here in Seattle. West Seattle is very important to me. My family's lived here since 2002. We used to live close to Holden and 28th, right by E.C. Hughes there. And then we moved further south to Arbor Heights neighborhood, where we've been since 2007. I have 2 kids who go to Our Lady of Guadalupe School up by the High Point neighborhood there. And we really love where we live, and I keep telling my wife we're not moving because we can't really afford the house we live in right now, much less moving to a new one. But that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about growth, some of the different aspects of it, and I guess we'll do the walk-up version here to make it fun to introduce our guests here on the panel. Lorena Gonzalez, Councilmember Lorena Gonzalez. She, of course, is an at-large, holds one of the at-large positions on the City Council, but gets special bonus points because she lives in West Seattle, too. All right. Coming up next is Ben Crowther. Here he comes. All right. Ben is the Policy and Legislative Affairs Director for the publication The Urbanist. Ben, thanks a lot for being here. Who do we have next? We have Michelle Chen. Come on down. Yep. She's with the Mayor's Office on HALA, the Housing Affordability and Livability Agenda. Michelle, thanks a million for being here. And I believe we have Susan Melrose. Yeah, there she is, with the West Seattle Junction Association. I haven't met Susan yet. I'm going to shake her hand as she comes by. Okay. Once again, I wanted to say thanks to Views for setting this event up. Thanks, Pete Spalding, for contacting me on this so I could get things going here. What we're talking about here with the Gathering of Neighbors is growing West Seattle. And I want to say as we get this started here, this is Gathering of Neighbors, not a gathering of people who shout at each other. We're going to try to have a good civil discussion here that I hope won't be the beginning and end of what we talk about when we talk about growth in our neighborhood, but really a beginning to starting this conversation. It's an important conversation, it's an ongoing one, and we'll get some important input on that today. So, I know over the course of the morning here, you've seen some of these open house exhibits. We're going to hold this panel and then break into those small groups later on. And I wanted to just keep our focus here on growth. That's what we're talking about here. Of course, it's everywhere in Seattle, one of the fastest growing cities in the U.S. But West Seattle is one of those many neighborhoods that is seeing that growth really happen here. This area also has several unique characteristics, however, getting in and out of the peninsula. I know we're going to talk about that today, but also the history of this area. We're the birthplace of Seattle as well, and I think there are some benefits and challenges to having that history in our area. So I want to start by asking each of our panelists this general question about your reaction to the growth we're seeing. And hopefully, if you can specify it to West Seattle, that would be helpful. Talk to us about growth here. What are the growing pains that you're seeing when it comes to West Seattle, and what are you doing to respond to them? Councilmember Gonzalez, can I start with you, please?
Sure. Thanks for having me here this morning. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. All right. Sometimes if I get too loud, tell me to tone it down a little bit. Before I make remarks, I just wanted to recognize my colleague, Councilmember Lisa Herbold, who represents West Seattle Park District, joined us here. And I know you all will get a chance to hear from her later this afternoon, but wanted to make sure that she was recognized as well. So this is a really important question. I think we all recognize that there are some definitely clear benefits of the growth we're experiencing in West Seattle, but I also think that also comes with some challenges. And I think in West Seattle in particular, I've lived in West Seattle since 2006 versus South Park, then in White Center, and now up the hill in the Junction. And I think the challenges around transportation are real. We still don't have light rail from West Seattle to anywhere. And that is something that I know will be discussed later this afternoon when you have the ST3 discussion. It's one of the things that this City Council is prioritizing heavily, making sure that the ST3 money, Sound Transit 3 money, includes enough money for us to get light rail in and out of West Seattle is going to be an absolute priority for this City Council. And we're going to need your help here in this community to make sure that we can design a line that meets the needs, the greatest need for our community here. So certainly transportation, traffic congestion, big issue. I think we're moving in the right direction. We got Move Seattle passed, which will lead to increasing the number of rapid line rides that we'll see out of the C line. That's a good result as a product of the Move Seattle. And I think that the other overriding issue are issues around income inequality. We have a city that is experiencing an incredible amount of growth, an incredible amount of an economic boom. But unfortunately, that benefit has been limited to very few people, and we're seeing a lot more people being displaced. Brian, you yourself just said that you're not looking at moving anytime soon because you could barely afford the home that you're in now, and I think that's a reality for many people in our community. I think it's somewhere near 30,000 people in our city are paying more than 30% of their income towards household expenses, and does not include transportation related costs. So I think there's a lot of different issues around income inequity that result in displacement as a result of our growth, particularly of communities of color and low-income communities. And we're also seeing a huge increase in our homelessness crisis. And those are realities of when times are good. And we recognize that at the City Council, and we also have clear strategies on figuring out how to turn the tide to make sure that Seattle truly is a place where everyone can prosper.
Thanks very much. Ben, can you help us frame some of these different issues? I used that phrase growing pains, and I just wanted you to help us identify some of those. Here in Seattle, growth takes a lot of different avenues in terms of its impacts. Talk to us about those impacts in West Seattle if you can.
Right. So again, my name is Ben. I'm with The Urbanists. For those who don't know, we're a local Seattle organization, and we advocate on a host of urban issues. Most commonly, it's housing, land use, and transportation. That's sort of our bread and butter. We're really excited about growth, and we love cities. That's kind of where we get the name urbanist and urbanism. We love cities. We love what makes cities so unique. And I think growth and density are part of what make cities such cool places to be. So I live downtown. I don't live in West Seattle. My husband's family has deep roots in the community. His grandma was actually sort of a refugee from World War II. She grew up in Germany. Went to Canada and had my husband's mom. They moved down to West Seattle, which is where she grew up, and they were here for a number of decades. So his family and my family has deep roots in the community. And when I think about stories like theirs, I think about people trying to find community and trying to find a gem of a city like what we have here in Seattle. I grew up in the east side, in the suburbs in Issaquah. And Seattle always stood out as a real gem to me. And unfortunately, we couldn't keep that a secret from everyone for too long. Everyone's kind of finding out. And we've become a really popular place. And I think that gives us a lot of opportunities for growth, for investment, for new infrastructure, for things like light rail into West Seattle. And not just into the junction. We want to see light rail down into Delridge. We really wanted to serve the entire community. We have a great opportunity with Bike Share, one of the new projects in the city that's been in the news. We favor a really strong public investment in that program so that the distribution can be equitable. We don't just want it downtown. We don't just want it in U District. We really want it to serve the entire city, so it's a network. We want to see it over here in West Seattle. People could be just hopping on a bike and riding along Alki or riding up to the Reservoir Park up in High Point. I think those are really magical opportunities that a city gives us, that more growth, more people gives us. We're really excited about that. Are there some pains? Yeah, there are. There's a tension between having a higher population, more growth, and then making sure we have the infrastructure to support that growth. And I think we're hearing a lot of the tension in the community right now. People saying there's too much congestion. We can't get around fast enough. We don't have the transportation infrastructure to support our growing population yet. And it's a bit of a chicken and the egg dilemma. Which comes first? You need a greater population to support those investments, but you need those investments in that infrastructure to support the population. So the good news is, as Lorena said, the city already has a plan and the region has a plan to support that growth. And I think we're going to see some really cool projects come to the community as a result.
Great, thanks very much. Michelle, can you jump into the conversation here? And I'd like you to really talk about what you've been doing with HALA, the Housing Affordability and Livability Agenda, because I think a lot of these community focus groups, you're talking about this growth right on the ground in areas like West Seattle. Talk to us about the work you're doing to deal with these growing pains I've been talking about.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you also for inviting me to West Seattle. I'm a Seattle native, but I don't get to West Seattle much.
Welcome.
I grew up in the northeast part of Seattle, and so I probably get to West Seattle maybe 2 or 3 times a year. So specifically, I want to just note that I'm the project manager for the Housing Affordability Livability Agenda. And as the HALA project manager, I am tasked with basically a good way of saying it is I herd a lot of cats, and that's 9 city departments, over 30 individual city staff people working on the various recommendations that came out of the HALA committee report. And as Brian mentioned, this is really the kickoff of the community engagement process. In January, we had a HALA launch, and there were over 400 people that showed up. It's an issue that everybody, whether you live in West Seattle or any other part of the city, is passionate about. We know growth is coming. Another 120,000 residents are predicted to move to Seattle in the next 20 years, and there's a real need for affordable housing. So specifically, as the project manager, I am working on about 30 initiatives that are part of the council-adopted work plan. Last fall, the council adopted a specific HALA work plan. And as part of that, the housing levy is a huge piece. It's a cornerstone to housing affordability in our city. And we also have a new program that we're proposing called the Mandatory Housing Affordability Program. So those are 2 pieces of legislation that we plan to send down to council in the next month or 2.
Okay, great. I was trying to track down, is there another HALA meeting coming up here in the West Seattle area soon? I was trying to check on the website real quick. What can you tell us?
Specifically, we don't have one scheduled yet, but the community focus groups, for which we got over 660 applications for, we will be making, we will be notifying about 150 to 200 participants, because again, the community focus groups, there'll be 4 focus groups, and depending on your neighborhood, you'll be assigned a focus group if you applied. And because we got so many applications, we are looking for very diverse people to be at the table. We are also looking for all the urban villages to be represented and neighborhoods around the urban villages, because the HALA recommendations are really about targeting growth in the urban villages per our Seattle Comp Plan and the State's Growth Management Act. And so we will have a meeting soon in West Seattle, but it will be part of the community focus groups once that starts off in April.
I know there's a HALA meeting here a couple months ago, but something we're all keeping track of in an ongoing conversation. Susan, let me bring you in here. I want to talk about the Junction. It is a historic business district established back in 1907, and I think some news in the past couple weeks actually brings some interesting perspective here, because I know in looking at a study that was done there recently, there was a historical survey around the Junction, some buildings now looking for landmark status. So I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking about where the past kind of meets the present and future in the Junction. I wanted to get your perspective on what growing pains, when I say that phrase, what does that mean to you?
Right, well, so the West Seattle Junction Association, we are a nonprofit comprised of the businesses in the West Seattle Junction, and the Junction has experienced a lot of development on California Avenue, and that has been difficult for many community members. When we think about the West Seattle Junction, we think about our small town streetscape, we think of our independent businesses and our small shops, and when we see multiple cranes in the air, that is hard for some community members to take, to see so much change happening in our neighborhood. And many times people would ask me, well, what are we doing about the development? How are we going to absorb all this change in our neighborhood? And that's a good question. And so Chaz Redman and Deb Barker with the Southwest District Council, we had that conversation at that level about what are we going to do about the changes in our neighborhood, and how can we hold on to what's special in our neighborhood. And that's when we started working together with the Southwest Historical Society to work on the West Seattle Junction Historical Survey Group. And the efforts of that body of work was to ask ourselves, what makes the Junction special? And as part of that effort, we interviewed property owners who are also business owners in the junction asking that question. And what came out so many times, it was the businesses, it was the mom and pops, it was the independent spirit that presents itself on California Avenue. And so many of our small independent businesses are owned by West Seattle community members. These are people doing business in our neighborhood for the benefit of all of us. And in addition to interviewing private property owners and building owners, we talked to the general public about what makes the junction special. And in so many cases, the individual businesses were mentioned. It was Easy Street Records, Husky Deli, Cupcake Real, Northwest Art and Frame. So it was a natural progression to be pointing to those special businesses that give us a sense of home. And so just, I don't know, what was it, 10 days ago, we completed our historical survey and had a press conference to release it and to share all the great results. And as a result, the Southwest Historical Society is moving forward with a landmark campaign for two very important businesses in the West Seattle area, the Ham Building and the Campbell Building, where we look at those buildings and we can see into our past, and we can have a sense of history of our neighborhood and what our whole city was built on. And I think that is important to maintain as we see all the new development. We have actually beautiful new buildings being built in the junction, but we are experiencing, the growing pains are difficult. Junction businesses appreciate all the new customers and all the new influx of foot traffic, and it has been positive for junction businesses and to have all those new residents. But the growing pains are difficult.
Parking, or what do you mean?
Well,
I'm guessing that's one.
Have you parked in the junction
I have.
on a Tuesday night?
Just throwing out a line there. Yeah. All right.
A major part of our organization is to maintain 4 private parking lots we provide 279 free parking spots for our customers for 3-hour parking. And those are becoming full and competitive. And so parking is a chore, but having all those residents right here in the urban village, and as transportation improves, hopefully it will all work together for a successful future for the junction.
Hey, Ben, let me jump back to you on this one, because I heard you mention some of the different things with regard to transportation and whatever else. I think that parking issue can't be overlooked. It's certainly an issue in the junction. I know I had girls going to Miss Kathy's studio of dance for many years. Any Miss Kathy fans out there in the house? Nice. Okay. Paying for parking, I did that a ton. It was a real challenge there. So I'm trying to figure out, I'm hearing what you're saying with regard to the future and bike share and a lot of great programs like that, but there's still a present with regard to the parking that's needed. I'm trying to figure out how to bring those together, because that's literally where the rubber meets the road on a lot of these issues. This is this growing pain we're talking about.
Right. Yeah, so we need to make sure that businesses in our communities are walkable and accessible. And the truth is that if our communities are dominated and built and designed only for cars, they can't and won't be successful. They won't be thriving. They won't be vibrant. I think if we look to our favorite neighborhood centers, they are historic. And those historic neighborhoods weren't built for cars. They were built to be wonderful, walkable, human-scale development, what we like to call it. So what does that mean in our current day and age? It means we need to look to the past and look to see how people got around. How did they get around? Well, there was housing above businesses. And that's often where the shop owners lived. So people would live up above the businesses, and they'd walk down and walk along the streets in their shops. That was their neighborhood center. It wasn't a place they drove to from the suburbs. That's where they lived. We need good bike infrastructure. We need bike lanes into these neighborhoods. There's great studies showing that bike lanes, even bike lanes that sacrifice some parking, actually are good for business. They see more transactions, higher turnover, greater volume and vibrancy in those neighborhoods. We need good walking infrastructure. So we do need to make room for folks who need to drive to a place for it to be accessible. And I think parking garages are a great kind of dense solution to that. But I think we also need to look at what we're doing with our public right-of-ways, our streets, and make sure that those are themselves attractions, putting festivities and farmers markets on the streets, and not just making them parking lots.
That's true. Farmers market's a big part of West Seattle, up by the junction too. Michelle, maybe I can bring you back in here because Ben started down this path, and I'd like to go this way, talking about some different transportation issues. I think about housing affordability, and that is such a close piece of it there. When you talk about living right above your business, great, works out for some people, doesn't work out for everybody here. How does that transportation part of the equation come together with what you're doing in terms of housing affordability?
The real framework to talk about housing and transportation and parks and all these other livability issues is really our Seattle 2035 comprehensive plan, which the city will be working on, I believe, in a month or two at council. The mayor's had his version out there for public comment, and the Seattle 2035 comprehensive plan has HALA as one of the implementation tools. And so as we implement the housing piece of the comp plan, we're looking at urban villages, urban centers. That's where the infrastructure exists, and that's where the investments are being made. And so I think we see this as kind of a multi-pronged, comprehensive, holistic approach to how we bring investments that we've made as a city in transportation like Move Seattle, in ST2 with light rail opening up now near Husky Stadium and taking you to the airport, and early education with preschool in the Metropolitan Parks districts. So all of these investments are being leveraged, and the HALA agenda is all about bringing a multi-pronged approach, and transportation is key to that too.
Okay, thanks very much for that. I want to head back over to Susan, if I might. When you talk about these growing pains, help me with some specific ideas here. Parking, an issue. I know getting around via bus can be an issue, certainly around the junction there. A lot of people use those services there. Do you have some concrete suggestions that you'd like to make in terms of easing those growing pains? Thoughts about that?
Well, that's a sort of an age-old question.
Yeah.
So much of the customers of the junction are West Seattle residents who live north and south of the junction, and when you're traveling 1 to 2 miles to the West Seattle junction to go out to Huskies for an after-dinner ice cream, sometimes jumping on the bus doesn't make the most sense. One thing that our neighborhood has talked about repeatedly, which we keep on coming back to, is a neighborhood circulator. We want to go, to the Morgan.
Quiet, you. All right, that's all right, please. Yeah.
Who loves the circulator? The idea of moving people through our own neighborhood. We like to patron all of the 3 junctions, the Admiral District, the junction, and the Morgan. And there's a way that just felt more neighborhood, so that we can grab on and to access that a little bit differently is an ongoing interest. But I think that people will be forced to make different choices on how they get to the junction, because parking is becoming increasingly difficult, and that's difficult for the business district when we're turning away customers who hope to park and be able to visit junction businesses, but then they get exacerbated and leave, and that's really disappointing to see if those choices are being made. So those are some
Lorena,
thoughts.
can I bring you in here? Because this circulator idea, I've heard it in other neighborhoods too. I'm trying to talk about the different things the council is doing to try to solve some of these issues, because this is an issue in West Seattle that I know is playing out in other parts of the city too. Move Seattle is making some progress there, I think, and making different investments in our neighborhood. But can you give us a council perspective on trying to solve this part of the equation?
Well, I think the idea of a neighborhood, what's it called?
Circulator.
Circulator. I think that those types of suggestions just highlight the overall principle in my mind, which is that we have to understand that when we're talking about transportation and mobility throughout our city and throughout our neighborhoods, that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. And we really do need to recognize that not everybody's going to hop on the bus, not everybody's going to hop in their car, not everybody's going to hop on a bike, not everybody's going to hop on a skateboard. Whatever it is you use to get around, that isn't going to work for everybody, and frankly, probably isn't going to work all the time for that one person either. So really what we need to work towards, and what I believe we've been working towards as both a city and a region, is making sure that we have options. Lots of transit options. So we have buses, we have light rail, we have cars, we have bikes. We need to make sure that as we anticipate the incredible amount of population growth that we expect over the next 10 to 20 years, that we are truly creating meaningful, accessible, affordable transit alternatives that fit every single neighborhood and every person. Here in West Seattle, I think we have a pretty good bus system. I love the Sea Line is one of my favorites if you can get on it. And with Move Seattle, I will acknowledge we have had really overcrowded, a really tremendously overcrowded Sea Line. And one of the benefits of having passed Move Seattle is that we're going to start seeing frequency and service in the Sea Line. And City Council is going to continue making sure that the city is accountable to the voters to make sure that those public dollars are being invested in a way that actually reduces traffic congestion. That's the promise we made to all of you in the course of advocating for Move Seattle, and it's the promise we need to deliver on. But at the end of the day, it is about making sure that we have as many transit options and alternatives for people to use throughout the day as we possibly can, and I believe we are moving in that direction. With Move Seattle, Sound Transit's coming down the pike. This is the time for us right now to be really bold as community members and as elected leaders to ensure that we are getting as many resources as we possibly can to be able to build out our transit network. And I won't say too much more about that, but because I know you all are going to be talking about it later. But I do think right now is the moment to do it. We cannot make the same mistake that we made back in the 60s when we passed on federal monies to build light rail throughout our city.
Maybe I'll just ask one more question of the crowd here. This one's a gimme, so we'll see how we do. Who's been stuck on the West Seattle Bridge before? Okay, everybody should be raising your hand. Come on. Yeah, right. Yeah, on the way here. Ben, let me draw you in here. I know I've been challenging you on a few different points here. I'd like to do it again. When it comes to the West Seattle Bridge, that really is the way out, the way in for so many people here. And I'm trying to think of different ways to get creative about that, because that rush hour traffic, I just don't feel like I'm trying to figure out that long-term goal there, because making that traffic flow there, emergency access being a big piece of it here. I know a lot of people in this community have talked about that. Making that happen, making it accessible, turns into a real challenge when you have that one option. West Seattle is very unique like that, the peninsula that we have here. So I'm just trying to think about options to make the West Seattle Bridge a better transit piece in our system here. Do you have some thoughts there?
Yeah, so I think if we're looking at congested city streets or the West Seattle Bridge, we have to look at how it's being used, and we have to try and figure out how it can be used efficiently so we get the most bang for the buck, most people over that bridge in any given period of time. And here's what we know about transportation in urban areas. Single occupancy vehicles are the least efficient way to transport people. They take the most space and move the least people. So what are more efficient forms of transportation? Well, exponentially so, public transit. A packed Sea Line bus moves how many cars worth of people? I don't know, but there's a great GIF out there showing a city block in Seattle and how people fit, right? So a Sea Line bus can carry a lot more people than a car could, or a couple cars that would take the same space. A train is even more efficient. Now, I won't say bike share is going to solve downtown to West Seattle. That's not really the purpose.
It's a long ride. Taking that a few times.
Scary right?
Yeah,
I don't
it can
know
be
if
too.
you looked over the edge there, but that gives me the. So anyway, so we need to look at ways to make that bridge more efficient. That means things like creating a transit-only lane so that those buses can make sure they get through in time. We need reliable and frequent transit, and if those buses are stuck in traffic along with everyone else, then they're not really a better option than cars. So if we give them a dedicated lane, then they're good to go. If we get high-capacity transit, things like light rail to West Seattle, that gives people a great new option, especially for the folks commuting around different neighborhoods. But I think transportation to and from West Seattle is more than the bridge. We need to look at not just transportation from downtown to West Seattle. We need to look at intra-neighborhood transportation like a circulator and inter-neighborhood transportation. For example, after this, I'm headed to Southeast Seattle. How am I going to get there? I don't know. It might take a transfer through downtown, and that seems pretty inefficient to me. So, everyone's telling me to take the 50. All right. Y'all did my transplanting for me. And there should be more than one option to get to another really vibrant part of the city. There should be more than one bus, and I've seen the 50. It's a pretty small bus. It is. So when we're looking at things, I don't have the magic solution in front of me, but I can say those are some tools that we already know and are implementing across the city that can make a really big difference.
And
Well, can I just add to that too? I think we cannot forget that because we're talking about growth and housing in particular, growth and housing and all those issues, but I think we can't overlook the concept of equitable transit-oriented development either. So this is the concept of, and if you haven't read the Seattle Times this morning, you should. There's a great article on the opening of the UW station that talks about the cost savings to a single person if you are able to live next to a light rail hub like the one that exists in the UW. So you could save over $10,000 a year by living next to a transit station like that. And so I think we really have to move in a direction, particularly in our urban villages and our urban centers, where we are just infusing that concept of equitable transit-oriented development into those neighborhoods as a matter of course and not as the exception. So that we really need to be better about building workforce housing in areas where people can rely on transit, and then of course constantly be watching for reliable, frequent service measures to ensure that the transit is actually getting people to where they need. And we're lucky that on the West Seattle Bridge we already have a dedicated bus lane. But
Don't come over to West Seattle much.
And I think that was a huge improvement, and I think when they painted the red on the lane, that made it even better. But there still will need to be coupled with enforcement. And so SPD and Metro Transit, et cetera, Metro Transit has an obligation to come out and make sure that the bus lanes are using the lane as they're supposed, that the buses are using the lanes as they're supposed to, and then SPD needs to make sure to be out there to ensure that people who are breaking the rules and using that lane when they're not supposed to be are also being held accountable. So it has to be a holistic approach.
I've seen that officer out there. He just points.
Yeah. Sometimes there's 3 of them.
No, they need it. They need it too.
Right.
Michelle, please.
Yeah, I'd like to just add on to Councilmember Gonzalez's statements about equity. Equity is also just a fundamental key policy driver in all of the HALA recommendations, which is why I think the preservation recommendations that we are also working on, HALA is not all about growth and new development. There is a very big bucket of work related to preservation, anti-displacement, and equity. And the housing levy has been a big resource for preserving affordable housing. We know there's still some pockets of the city where affordability at market rate exists as well. So we're working on things like at the state level, property preservation tax exemption, which made it out of the Senate, but it's still in the House. So just other examples of how we're trying to be a more inclusive and equitable city through preservation efforts.
And if I could just add, because I know that we've heard a lot from the West Seattle Junction Association, Business Association. One of the things that the city is currently exploring is the issue of commercial affordability, because what we are seeing is that as these older buildings are being sold to the highest bidder, that when they are redeveloped, the commercial space that exists and that's available there is really, really large, which effectively corners small businesses out of the market, because you cannot, as a small business, afford a 9,000 square foot retail space. It's just impossible. And so the city is really looking very closely at how do we create commercial affordability as a strategy to ensure that we continue to have a space in our city for small businesses and for those mom and pop shops that really do make our neighborhood business districts what they are.
Yeah, Susan, I was going to jump to you right after her. Just with regard to that. Can you give us that on-the-ground feel for what some of the different shops there are going through? I know rents are going up in a lot of different places across the city. It's affecting businesses too.
Absolutely. In the redevelopment that we've seen on California Avenue, we have seen a lot of national chains go in, a lot of, some commercial spaces in terms of banks. And what we haven't seen go into the new spaces on California Avenue is retail. Retail is one sector that I think is really valuable to our neighborhood, to be able to go to the junction and get that local flavor and have, shops, curating merchandise that I think, it makes it interesting. And it's an interesting experience to come to the junction for our small independent retailers. The Downtown Seattle Association, at the bequest of the Office of Economic Development, did a study. And over the last 5 years, from 2010 to 2015, in the Junction Urban Village, we saw rent per square footage double in the last 5 years. Double. We also saw that the vacancies over the last 5 years went from about 13% down to maybe 3%. So it's very competitive to get commercial space in the West Seattle Junction. So that competition is bringing costs up as well, which again make it harder for the small independent businesses to be finding commercial space. So that is something that we'd like to be working with the Office of Economic Development, and Councilmember Herbold reached out to me as well. So I think it's an interesting conversation.
Definitely work in progress.
Yeah, and I'd love to piggyback on that. So when we talk about affordable, accessible neighborhoods, we talk a lot about rent, and that's been the majority of the conversation, which is essential. But we also need to talk about business. For example, Capitol Hill is expensive, for those who aren't aware. Part of the reason it's expensive is not just because rent is $2,000 a month for a 600-foot one-bedroom apartment. It's also because if you're looking for dinner, it's hard to find a plate for cheaper than $12. It's hard to find, there's Whole Foods and QFC. Is there an affordable place to shop? Tammy Morales, when she was running for city council, brought a really interesting issue to the table and to my attention, which was not only affordable food access, but culturally appropriate food access. If the only thing that's nearby is a Whole Foods, and that doesn't really serve what you cook, then it's not really great food access for you. So when we talk about affordable neighborhoods, we need affordable commercial rent. And part of that is smaller spaces. And I think smaller spaces overall is a really great way to build affordable spaces for people. So what does that mean? It means looking at things like micro-housing for folks that are looking for an entry point into the city. It means small business spaces. If you go into some bigger cities, they have small, really long but narrow storefronts, right? So you only get a little window on the storefront, but the space is deep. And that allows them to sort of maximize their potential, lowers their rent, but allows them to get their foot in the door so they can start their business and grow it as they need to. If the only thing going in on a street, like what's happened to Broadway, to my community, is banks. Banks are, it seems like, the majority of Broadway, not the small businesses. That's not a place where I want to be. It's not a place where I can afford to be, either as a business person, a patron, or a resident.
Can I bring in Michelle at this point? I'm trying to figure out that intersection between affordable business rent, affordable home rent, because I know they're connected and I know it's something you deal with. Help me out with those two thoughts coming together if you can. Please.
Well, just another well-known statistic, but rents in the city over the last 5 years have increased by 29%. So it's a huge burden on many of our households. And so the mandatory housing affordability program has both a commercial component and a residential component. The commercial framework legislation was passed last November by City Council, and whenever there will be new commercial development in the city, they will have to pay a fee, per square footage fee, to the city that will then pay for affordable housing. That is also known as the commercial linkage fee, which council members O'Brien worked
Yes.
closely with the mayor on. And now, we are working on the residential enabling legislation. The residential component basically requires that any new residential, multifamily residential development either perform by building those affordable units in the building or pay in lieu a fee, so that that fee then can be used to build affordable housing. So that's, in my world, in my kind of policy world, what's happening with respect to the intersection between commercial and residential.
Some very important policies, and I'm sorry that we don't have more time to dive into those because there's a lot of different controversies surrounding those and some good points to make. We need to wrap up this discussion because there's other parts of this event that people need to see today. I'm going to go down the line, and Susan, maybe I can start with you and we can head on in. So this is a continuing conversation, as I mentioned, about growth, how it happens between our communities, between our city leaders here. What thoughts, ideas, issues do you want to make sure are guiding this discussion going forward from your perspective?
Well, I certainly think that that as the West Seattle Junction neighborhood redevelops, to be helping independent and small shops gain access to these commercial spaces. I think that is critical to the health of our business district, and I think it is important to our neighborhood. And so policies to that end would be welcome, and I look forward to working on it.
Thanks very much. I'll just head down the line here. Michelle, your thoughts, and I know you're part of this discussion in terms of guiding it. What are some of the ideas that you are hoping will guide this discussion about growth going forward?
Yeah, I take it very personally in that I mentioned earlier that I grew up in Seattle. I did leave Seattle and then come back, but I always knew I would because I knew how great Seattle was for me growing up here and to raise a family. So personally, I feel like what gets me going is the fact that Hala is an agenda of lots of ideas that make our city continue to be as equitable and inclusive as possible, keep that diversity of the neighborhoods together. I hope that those are some of the things that really carry us forward with our decision makers. I also think that the council in its foresight was very clear about how we do community engagement, that we at a minimum really get the traditionally underrepresented voices to the table. So that's something that we are working very hard to do. And I really, just to put it out there, I don't want Seattle to be a San Francisco. So to that extent, I want Seattle to work on something, and Hala offers us that something.
Okay. Ben, your thoughts in terms of guiding this discussion about growth going forward?
Growth for us is a really stellar, exciting opportunity in a lot of ways. It's an opportunity for new people to discover what makes our city such a cool place to be, to find new neighbors, new friends, and to get some really cool new programs and investment in infrastructure in our communities. Light rail is a lot more feasible with 120,000 new residents than without. So I think we have some really cool opportunities, and we want to make sure that as we're growing, Seattle is a place for everyone. It needs to be equitable growth. We can't just be building more luxury apartments. Those have their place, but we need housing for everyone. We need business spaces for everyone. We need to welcome new college grads and immigrant families that are seeking Seattle as a safe refuge. So growth is an opportunity. Seattle should be a place for everyone. I think those are our values, our Seattle values, and I'm really excited to share those values with new residents.
Lorena, I'll let you have the last word. You can't just say ditto.
Oh, man. Brian's interviewed me a few times, so he knows I sometimes do that. But in spite of that admonition, I am going to say that I think the rest of the panelists and co-panelists have said it very, very well. I think my focus will continue on being to ensure that Seattle is a place of prosperity for everyone. And that, we really do at the City Council appreciate the risks of displacement as a result of all of this growth. And we are certainly in a better position than a lot of other metropolitan cities like us who are really having a rough time with with their economic development. And Seattle is not in that position. Seattle is in a position where we are experiencing an incredible amount of growth that it will likely continue to exist for the next 5 years, and it's up to us as elected leaders to make sure that as that growth continues, that we don't encumber the growth, but that we make sure that we are creating a framework in which we are truly creating an equitable urban city where there is a place for you to be if you have a family, where there is a place for you to be if you want to live in a studio, where there's a place for you to be if you want to take the bus or if you want to drive your car. And I think that is the biggest challenge that we have as a city council, and I'm gonna make sure that we continue to talk about the racial and social justice impacts of this growth, because when I hear statistics that the Central District is gonna be 10% Black in the next 10 years, I get mad. And we should all be mad about that.
Very good. Thank you, Councilmember Gonzalez. Thanks